Hi, I am Dr. Amitabh Banerjee, author of the book COVID-19 Pandemic, A Third Eye. Let me give you a introduction of how this book came about and something about my background. I served in the Indian Armed Forces for almost 3 decades. 2 decades were spent working as a field epidemiologist, investigating outbreaks in different parts of the country, including tribal areas, counterinsurgency areas, and I also, for 4 years, I led the mobile epidemic investigating team of the armed forces, where I had opportunity to investigate firsthand outbreaks of respiratory infections, outbreaks of German measles, outbreaks of typhoid, epidemics of malaria, food poisoning, and other communicable diseases in different parts of the country. So when this COVID uh, outbreak, after leaving the armed forces, taking premature retirement almost 2 decades ago, since then I have been teaching in a medical college in Pune. And I was following the pandemic since it began. And I was also given an assignment by one of the national newspapers to write columns chronicling the evolution of the pandemic. So it started with fortnightly and weekly columns, and I was taking help of my students and faculty in the Department of Community Medicine, where I was working as an epidemiologist, to analyze the data. And we started analyzing, and we found very fascinating patterns. The pandemic was not impacting all countries, all continents, all races in a similar fashion. The Caucasians, the Western countries, were having a much larger impact, particularly mortality, compared to the Asian and African countries. And initially, we thought it is due to the higher age, because elderly were more vulnerable, nursing homes, old age homes in the Western countries. But while we analyzing the data and tabulating the data, we found more than the age, it was the obesity which was causing the higher mortality. And two countries which illustrated this was Japan and Brazil. Japan had a higher age, even higher than the Western countries, but its obesity was not high. It was less than obesity was far less than 1/3 of the Western countries, just like other Asian and African countries, and it had a much lower mortality compared to the Western countries. Similarly, on the other hand, Brazil, which had a younger age, much younger age than Japan, it had a much higher obesity, which was almost equal to the European countries and the USA. And it had mortality almost at times in the latter part of the pandemic exceeding that of the Western countries. So obesity came out as an important factor, and the same trend was noted in other countries. Even in African continent, the countries like South Africa, which had higher obesity, had among the African countries, it had a higher mortality in spite of higher vaccination coverage. So this is one thing. And then also the other patterns, we noted that particularly the lockdowns were, we analyzed the impact of the lockdown, and we found that in spite of very strict lockdowns, particularly in India, the virus spread unchecked. And we also studied in these columns, we recorded, we chronicled that what was the origin of these lockdowns. And it is very fascinating to note that they were not based on any hard data. There was no evidence that lockdown works or social distancing works. And it was based on some computer simulation models of a high school project. So, I mean, it's very fascinating to note that this such important decisions were taken by esteemed bodies like the CDC, the WHO, and other governments, almost all the world governments, on simulated evidence, on computer models. And this, as a field epidemiologist, I found this quite surprising that the same measures were applied to all countries when the lockdowns, particularly, it defied even common sense at times that countries like India and other developing countries, the houses and slums are very crowded. And if you lock down people, you are increasing the population density. You are bringing, it is not possible, logistically possible to maintain that so-called social distancing, which also there was no strong evidence. So anyway, these views were came out as newspaper columns, and then we had good feedback regarding these columns, and then we got an idea to compile some of these columns, and this was how this book came about. And the take-home messages are there. We have tried to make it interesting reading because most of the scientific writing can become quite dull. So as a columns, they were targeted at the general audience, limited, and to make it interesting, the book is written with a lot of analogies from, say, mythology, from the world of cricket, from the world of the wars, military campaigns, and different sort of storytelling, so that the reader grasps the complex issues in a manner. We try to break down the complex epidemiology to minimum jargon, and so that the flow is maintained and the readability is maintained. And I hope you will enjoy going through this, or you may enjoy the audio version of this. And thank you.